Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. I'm Dr. Shannon Ray, and today I will be reciting a poem I wrote called The Ultimate Abstraction. And you have to keep in mind that as a person with a mathematical background, what I consider poetry, like the poetry of a mathematician, is going to sound like it's going to sound kind of academic, I suppose. But the way that I distinguish poetry from not poetry is based off of whether or not I am simply motivated by my feelings in the moment. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is whenever I'm in some sort of state where I just feel compelled to communicate something, then I just stop what I'm doing. I just start writing. And I take whatever those feelings are and I'm trying to translate them onto a page. And so, like I've mentioned before, this is kind of what I would consider something like a rambling state of mind, based off of TED rambles. And so my poetry is considered poetry because it's more me trying to take my subjective feelings, my subjective essence. I'm trying to listen to my muse, listen to that voice in the back of my head, and just listen what is being told to me. So whenever I'm in that state of being, I just have to get something down on paper. I have to communicate it. That would be considered a poem for me. And so that's why, even though this may not sound like poetry as one may expect, for me, this is a very poetic process. And this poem is trying to communicate the relationship between paradoxes, enlightenment, faith, and truth. Those are the themes of this poem. And part of the nature of this theme is first this is such a difficult. I have been struggling to figure out how to introduce this poem so that it makes sense. Like, you have no idea how much I've been struggling to communicate this. It's not been easy. I'll tell you that, because it's something that quickly devolves into like really abstract nonsense. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's something that I can imagine you guys sitting back and thinking to yourselves, what in the hell is he talking about? And so I've been consistently trying to find like, where is the best way to like condense this into something that's more obvious. And it has been challenging, not gonna lie. I mean, one of the things that I hope that people can just take as obvious, or they can take for granted, is that one of the things that differentiates humans from other minds is our ability for abstraction. I mean, can we please just like accept that as just a fact? Our ability to use tools, our ability to come up with abstractions like algebra and calculus and all the things that we have developed in society and culture and all this stuff. Like, we know that a worm can't comprehend these things. We know that that chimpanzees can only comprehend these things to a certain degree. Like, go and try to explain to a chimpanzee how a computer works. You think that they're going to have the capacity to abstract that concept into something meaningful for them to understand? Of course you don't. I don't. We don't. We all know we can't do it. And so there is something about our capacity as creators and our capacity to conceptualize, and conceptualization becomes more powerful the more you can generalize. So abstraction is associated with the idea of generalization. As you generalize things more and more and more, and you're not talking about specific cases, then the more you are abstracting a concept. And this is clear whenever people first start taking algebra. Like, prior to that, you're usually dealing with concrete numbers, specific numbers. You're adding and subtracting and dividing and multiplying numbers. So like, it's very specific and obvious. But then when you go into algebra, you start adding and subtracting symbols. Like, what the hell is that? Now suddenly you have these symbols that can represent any number, or it can represent a real number, or it can represent a complex number. It's like, this thing is just some abstract concept that you're now manipulating. It's more general because X could be anything, you see. And so this is also the case when you go from like special relativity to general relativity. General relativity is more general, therefore it's more difficult. It's the more difficult of the relativities. And so this is kind of like one of the goals of mathematics, is this process of becoming more and more general, proving more things, like trying to distill concepts, trying to distill a significant amount of information or data into simple concepts or simple symbols, so that these simple concepts or these simple symbols here contain all the information associated with whatever, you know? And so that's the process of abstracting, of generalizing. The more you can exist within abstractions, the less you think in terms of black and white. You know what I mean? Like the more freedom you have to think, the more fluidity you have, the more degrees of freedom you have, the more, yeah. Because think of something like a bit, and configuration of the bit can be black or white, up or down, on or off, 0 or 1, right? These are all the possible configurations of a bit. And this idea of black and white thinking is the idea that, oh no, it's black, it can't be white, or it's white, it can't be black. And oftentimes the answer is somewhere in between. It's usually not that obvious. It's usually not that simple, you know? And so to allow yourself to be open to the idea that it can be one or the other is to not force yourself into one or the other. So you have to be able to hold up in your mind that it's not black or white. And this is actually, I think this goes back to the idea of memory. Like this takes memory to do that. Because if you say something is black, then it's locked in as black. Okay, that thing is black. But if you say, I don't know if it's black or white, it could be one or the other, you have to hold that in your head. You have to hold that as like, I don't know what this is. It has not yet taken a configuration. It could be either. So now you have to juggle that. So then imagine that you're going around, and the more things that you can't simply say it's this versus it's that, the more things you have to juggle around in your head, the more things you have to keep track of. And you can think of this as something as simple as, say you come home from work. You come home from work, everyone has to have this process. Say you have kids, you're married, you come home from work, and you have like 5 things you have to do. Okay, first I need to come in, I need to take out the trash, then I need to take a dog for a walk, then I need to do this. I need to go grab my keys, and like there's all these things that you have to do. And so the more things you have to keep track of in your head, you have to hold those things up in your mind. And then as you start to accomplish the goals, it's like, okay, that's done. Okay, that's done. It's like you're releasing memory from your mind. And that's the same process of not saying that something is black or white and saying it could be black or white. Now you have to hold that in your head. You have to hold that up. And then the more of these things that you're not forcing into black or white, the more of them that you're holding up together, the more memory you have to expend to hold those things up. And so this is how I'm thinking of the relationship between abstraction and one's ability to conceptualize. Because I'll tell you this right now, one of the skills that I've learned, so this is actually a much better example than the house example I just used. One of the things that I learned to become a good physicist, to become a good scientist, is going to seminars or communicating with another scientist about their work, about their research. And this process is one in which someone is specialized in some topic. You probably, for the most part, have no experience or little experience or tangential experience with what they're working on. And this person is an expert who knows all the details. And so as they're talking to you, often what happens is they start saying stuff and you don't understand what they're saying. This is the same thing when you go to a seminar. You don't understand what they're saying. And so you have to, as they're telling you things, you have to go, I didn't understand that. And then you put that somewhere in the back of your head. But while you're holding on to the fact that you don't understand that, you have to keep on taking in information as you're talking to them. So then you're like, okay, you're usually in some sort of state of mind in which you are holding on to what you don't understand And then you're resolving them as you get more information during the conversation. So you have to be able to have the conversation, pay attention to what they're saying, track what you don't understand, resolve those things that you don't understand in real time as new information comes in. You see? And so every single time you get something that they tell you something that you don't understand, that's another little thing that you have to juggle. Okay, I don't understand this. How do I solve this? And then you get another one. So imagine you're talking to someone and the entire time you are not resolving these things as the conversation goes. You're just accumulating more and more things that you don't understand. And you're just having to go, eventually that thing is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But the thing is that to be a good scientist is to be able to hold those in your head as you talk. And one thing that I know is that that is a skill that requires time to develop. And your capacity to do it is directly related to how skilled or how experienced you are. It's like a muscle that you have to train to be able to get good at doing it. And so that's the idea of the relationship between abstraction and conceptualization. And if you can conceptualize more abstract things and the relationships between them, the more you can build a larger conceptual space. So your conceptual space is bounded, like the space of conceptualization that you abide in, that you live in, your language, your perception of reality, that is bounded by your ability to comprehend and embody and hold up abstractions. Your capacity to hold up abstractions. And this is another thing that I've come to realize as a physicist and mathematician, is that a lot of times when you learn a new mathematical concept, it's really difficult. Like every time you use it, you have to go, okay, how does this work? You have to stop and think, how does this work again? And you have to go through the motions in your head, and it's like you're doing a calculation. Like, how does this work again? And it's like a heavy thing. It's like a heavy machine you're carrying around. Like you're carrying around this heavy mathematical machinery in your head, and you have to be able to use your active memory when you're communicating with someone to be able to take their information and feed it through the machine. And the less familiar you are with the machine, the more difficult it is. And so imagine that when you're taking in data, you're holding together some sort of abstract machine to process the information. And the more familiar you are with the machine, the less energy it takes to operate it. It's almost like the more you interact with it, the more you experience it, the more it gets compressed in your mind, because it's something that happens so often. You get this muscle memory that you don't have to like, okay. And so once you've compressed your relationship with the machinery into something manageable, now you can go and you can take some other machinery and start going, okay, how does this work again? And then you have to keep using it, and you keep using it, and you compress that. And so it's almost like you're taking these high dimensional abstract concepts and you're compressing them as you have a better relationship with them. And the more of these that you can compress and make part of yourself so that they speak to you, they speak to you to write poetry, for example. The more you can compress these things into yourself, the more freedom you have to take on more abstractions. And the more you keep doing this, then the higher dimensional space your mind functions in. The higher dimensional space your mind functions in, the higher resolution your concepts are. And this idea of going from lower resolution, lower dimensional conceptualizations, lower dimensional abstractions to higher dimensional abstractions is part of enlightenment. And the poem itself is trying to communicate that within a lower dimensional perception, and just think of these abstractions as a language, a model of reality. Within a lower dimensional abstraction, it is inevitable, this is a claim that I'm making, it is inevitable that you will come across a idea or a concept that your language just can't resolve. And this lack of ability to resolve the concept results in a contradiction. But this contradiction is not due to the fact that there's something wrong with the logical structure of your language. This contradiction is due to the fact that your language does not have the necessary resolution, the necessary degrees of freedom to resolve this concept. And so in the actual poem, I use imaginary numbers as an example. So I won't spoil it here, but imaginary numbers are the consequence of a contradiction, because the real numbers just did not have sufficient resolution to deal with numbers like the square root of negative x. It just can't do it. And it's not because there's anything wrong with the construction of real numbers. It's just that there's a limit to its ability to resolve concepts. And so this is part of a lot of what I discuss in the podcast. Like, again, where are we at right now? In what you're listening to, where are we at right now? We're in the concept of resolution, the idea of resolution, the idea that a certain perspective, a certain way of thinking can never give anything exact. There's always uncertainty. There's always entropy, a lack of resolution, a lack of completeness. And so these points where there's a lack of completeness, like the idea of imaginary numbers in the real number system, this point of incompleteness is what I call a gauge gate. It is an objective truth of entropy. There's always some incompleteness within any language. And when you come across a contradiction that's not due to delusions or lies or logical inconsistencies, a contradiction that is due to a language's inability to resolve a concept due to the size of its abstraction, once you come across those contradictions, then from those contradictions, that's the path to a higher dimensional perception. That is the path to a higher dimensional perception. And within that higher dimensional perception, when you look back down at the contradiction is resolved. That's the idea. The contradiction is resolved from this higher dimensional perception. And the idea is that when you go from the lower dimensional language in which the contradiction existed to the higher dimensional language, when you go there by resolving the contradiction, then the higher dimensional language has to contain all of the information of the lower dimensional language plus additional information. That additional information is what is used to resolve the contradiction. And the thing about this process is that the contradiction itself suggests not truth. And so to actually traverse this gauge gate, this point in which this hole, think of it as a hole, to traverse this hole in perception, you must believe that the contradiction has truth in it. You have to leave the borders of your perception. You have to have faith. You have to go out into the wilderness. You walk through the hole. The only thing on the other side is emptiness. And you have to create order there. You have to go beyond the safety zone of what has already been mapped out from your current perceptual realm. You have to step outside of that. And that requires faith that the contradiction contains truth. And I think that this is the essence of a paradox. Paradoxes are like true contradictions. They're contradictions that are true, which I think is an oxymoronic concept. Because, like I said before, in logic, contradictions imply not truth. So a contradiction that is true sounds like nonsense. And that's why the ultimate abstraction is A and not A. It's A and not A being true simultaneously, like superposition or like the Schrodinger cat example, dead and alive. What? That makes no sense. And so that's the whole point, is that if it is the case that abstraction is directly related to conceptualization, and conceptualization is associated with using language, models of reality, perception, And the capacity to use language is the essence of what it means to be a mind, to be a creator. If this is the case, then your capacity to be a creator depends on your ability to comprehend abstractions. And when someone gives you an abstraction that looks like blatant, obvious nonsense, and you're like, nah, I believe it's true, then it's incumbent on you. It's like your responsibility. Now you have to go on a process of discovery where you resolve the contradiction and you're like, oh, these things are actually the same. They can be true simultaneously. And this is part of what I'm doing with this idea of resolving Buddhism and Christianity. Is Buddhism and Christianity are up and down. They are opposites. In Buddhism, the entire point is to let go of self. Let go of an identification of self. Perception. Let go of perceptions. Let go of dharmas. That's the point. And perceptions are dependently originated, which means that they are relational. There is no self without its relation to others. So any perception implies a relationship. So that means that to let go of self is to let go of all relationships. But Christianity is the exact opposite. The Christianity is to be in line with the perception of truth. It is to be in relationship with Jesus. It is to be in relationship with God. Its foremost purpose is to put you in relationship with God and Jesus. Actually, to be in relationship with God through Jesus. So it's completely dependent on relationship. But in Buddhism, all perceptions, all relationships only result in illusions. They only result in illusions. They're not real. And so what you have is you have the contradiction at the point of relationship versus non-relationship. And then I'm making a claim that these two opposite directions are actually the same. Up is down. And you're like, keep talking nonsense. But the whole point is that if you can find how up is down, then you've created a perception in which there is no contradiction, in which this is clearly true. And so this perception will thrust you out of the previous perception that there clearly cannot be true simultaneously. And this is the point of koans in Buddhism. This is the point of koans. And so that's why one of my favorite sutras is the Vajra Prajna Paramita Sutra, because it's just full of koans, koan after koan after koan. Because these koans are basically like little contradiction, like little paradoxical riddles that when you resolve them, bring you to higher states of enlightenment. And so what I like about, I've tried, like I said, a million times to try to figure out the best way to communicate these ideas and has failed miserably multiple times. And part of that failure was trying to actually explain the Vajrapanya Paramita Sutra, which ultimately I would argue is the idea of the Tathagata, and the Tathagata being the suchness, the oneness, that which is not beholden to the law of impermanence, that which is eternal, that which runs through all things, and does not arise, is not born, does not attain, and that is the source from which things arise. And so to take beings to nirvana, to take them to extinction, is to convince them that their essence, that their true essence or whatever is empty, which is to let go of self, which then is to be one with everything. to be one with the Tathagata. And one thing that they say in the sutra is, if a bodhisattva is trying to obtain anuttara samyak sambodhi, they should take the vow that they want to bring all sentient beings to extinction. But once all sentient beings are brought to extinction, no sentient being was brought to extinction. So my summary of the sutra, this is how I understand it. If I were to summarize it in a koan of my own, it would be, my summarization of the Vajrapanya Paramita Sutra would be, convincing sentient beings that there are no sentient beings to be liberated is the way to liberating sentient beings. And this can most viscerally be understood by the phrase, we are the universe pretending to be individuals. Once these phrases together are truly understood, the universe can really come to know itself, thus becoming conscious, thus becoming awakened. It is to awaken the Tathagata to itself, thus seeing that it is the Tathagata and no longer identifying with any dharma, lifespan, or self. To recognize that all sentient beings are not individuals, but are merely reflections of God that are made in the image of God. Once a sentient being comprehends this, they no longer cling to the minor self, the tiny world, the morning dew, the tiny world that comes in and out of existence like lightning through the perception of self, but instead sees itself for what it truly is, the universe pretending to be a reality consisting of many selves. So this is kind of how I understand the Vajrapanya Paramita Sutra, is that any identification of self is dependently originated. Therefore, there is no individual self. They do not exist. And so once a self recognizes that it is merely all, because there is no individual. There is no self that is not dependently originated. So all selves exist due to relationships with everything. And so once you understand that, then to understand yourself as everything, then you see you never came into existence. You never stopped existing. You just always were. Because you are everything. The idea that you're not everything has always been an illusion. And so this is how I understand the Vajrapanya Paramita Sutra, is that it seems like a bunch of koans to try to communicate this to people, to try to communicate this to minds. And so that's my best understanding of the sutra. And another part of my understanding is the phrases involving that nothing can be attained are central to my understanding of this sutra. To attain is to have something that belongs to you. This requires the existence of a self. This existence ties one to the idea of a sentient being, and to truly understand is to know that there are no sentient beings. There is only the suchness that always exists. This is made clear when thinking about my feelings of grandeur. To think, I want to attain glory and burn my achievements into history, is to think that anything I develop or perceive belongs to me. It doesn't. It is to the Tathagata. The Tathagata can't attain itself because it already is. There is nothing to attain, because to attain is to be without, and then to be with. And this requires a self to be without, and then to be with. Yeah. So I've already discussed the poem and how it relates to paradoxes and enlightenment. And now I want to discuss the poem and how it relates to faith and truth. And to do that, I want to look at things in terms of what it's like to read the Bible. And a lot of times, like when you read the Bible, if you're a person of faith or you're a person who believes, then when you're reading the Bible, you think of it as the Word of God. You think of it as something divinely inspired, something given to us from a higher state, from a higher being that has been handed down to us. And if you accept it in that way, then when you read it, you accept what's in it as true. But the thing is a lot of the ideas in the Bible can sound contradictory. They can, not make sense. They're not obvious. It's a very challenging book, and it challenges you to begin with the belief that it is true. And then anything after that, it's your job to discover how it's true. And this is the basis of the poem. The basis of the poem is the idea that if you're given propositions that lead to contradictions, then typically within logic, the fact that the propositions lead to contradictions is evidence that they are not true. And so this is what I'm defining as the ultimate abstraction. It is to believe that when something leads to the conclusion of A and not A being true simultaneously, meaning the thing and the opposite thing are true simultaneously, when something leads to that, you accept it as true despite the fact that the contradiction is evidence that it's false. And so one of the examples that I like the most, when I first started reading the Bible, for some reason I just started reading John. And in John 6, there's a section called Jesus, the Bread of Life. And what I like about this section is that Jesus is talking about how he is the bread of life, and that his literal flesh and blood are like his literal flesh and blood. Let's see. I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. So when you hear that, so the funny thing about that is within the Bible itself, like as Jesus is saying these things, the crowd he's speaking to, they're like, what is this guy talking about? Isn't this the guy whose parents are Joseph and Mary? Like, what's he talking about? He came down from heaven. Like, what is this? Now, mind you, the crowd he's speaking to are the same people the night before saw him walk on water and feed a bunch of people with a small amount of bread and fish, and then feed thousands. And so they saw him perform miracles. And despite those miracles, when he gives them this challenging thing, he's telling you, I tell you, this is true. This is the truth. And they're just like, what is he talking about? Like, I can't follow this. It's like, what's it say specifically? On hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? And so this idea of being given something that makes absolutely no sense, by all reason, sounds illogical and nonsensical. But then to believe it to be true is to be invited to discover how it's true. And so what I'm proposing is that in cases like this, the fact that it doesn't make sense might be a consequence of the limit of your ability to perceive. It's the limit of your perception. Within your understanding of reality, within the plane of thought that you mostly function on, this sounds completely nonsensical. But the whole point to the teachings of Jesus is that he's trying to make you an enlightened person. He's trying to pull you up to be more aligned with the divine, to be more aligned with the Father. And so he's trying to pull you up. And so, he says, does this offend you? What if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. And then it says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. So again, in this instance, you have these people who are just like, nah, this is too ridiculous. I'm turning my back on you. And the fact that they turned their back on him is because they don't truly believe in him. Because if they really put their faith in Jesus, if they really believe, then when he tells them that this is the truth, even though they can't comprehend it, they will believe it to be true, and then try to discover how it's true because they believe it's true prior to the evidence that it's true. And this is the essence of faith. This is the essence of faith. The essence of faith is to accept something as true prior to evidence that it is true, prior to that. But that basis of believing it's true isn't just based off of a whim. It's because you are in relationship with the truth, or you feel as though you're in relationship with truth, or you believe you're in relationship with the truth. And to believe that you're in relationship with truth requires confidence. It requires past experiences, a knowing that you are not someone who is prone to lying to themselves. You are not someone who is prone to rejecting the truth. You are not someone who has developed a way of being in which you are deceiving yourself and deceiving others. And so once you, and it's to be able to identify the spirit of truth when you're interacting with it, such that and this is part of the whole point with Jesus, the idea that when you read the Bible, at first it may be something you don't have confidence in, but as you read it, you start to gain and build confidence through living a life in accordance with how it tells you to live, and then seeing the fruits of it. And then as you gain experience and you start gaining knowledge, you start seeing like, oh, this thing is communicating something very deep to me. And you start to build a confidence in the book based off of its works, based off of its fruits, based off of its teachings, based off what you know to be true, what you know to be righteous. And then you try to figure out, is this in alignment with that? And once you come to some understanding, once the book has convinced you that it is true, then when it gives you challenging ideas, you accept it, even if you're unable to understand why. And so this explanation is just part of what I'm getting at. I mean, there are other ideas associated with contradictions and paradoxes and enlightenment that I surely won't try to go into now. But man, I hope that this turned out in some way that is clear. All right. Now I give you the ultimate abstraction. The Ultimate Abstraction by Dr. Shannon Ray. The ultimate abstraction is A and not A because it is a pure contradiction. It is for a proposition A to be true and its opposite not A to be true simultaneously. To find the perspective from which A and not A is true is to go beyond the limit of reason within one's language to resolve the contradiction. To find the perspective from which A and not A is true is to go beyond the limit of reason within one's perspective to resolve the contradiction. To find a perspective from which A and not A is true is to go beyond the limit of reason within one's paradigm to resolve the contradiction. To find a perspective from which A and not A is true is to go beyond the limit of reason within one's model of reality to resolve the contradiction. To find the perspective from which A and not A is true is to go beyond the limit of reason within one's worldview to resolve the contradiction. But to attempt such a feat is to accept A and not A as true prior to the existence of evidence that justifies the belief. Why? Because, by definition, contradictions imply not truth. Within logic, one can prove a proposition is false by demonstrating that the consequences of the proposition lead to a contradiction. Therefore, to be presented a contradiction and believe it to be true is to say to oneself, despite the evidence that it is false, I believe it to be true. This then requires those who believe in the contradiction to find an explanation for why it is true. That is, they must enter into a process of discovery where they find the logically sound context in which the contradiction is resolved. Because if the information that demonstrated the contradiction to be true already existed within one's perspective, then it would not be a contradiction. Let us make the claim that there are two types of contradictions. Type 1 are contradictions that result from genuine falsehood, delusion, lies, and logical inconsistencies. Belief in these contradictions is due to the subjective failure of those who believe. Type 2 contradictions, on the other hand, are those that are due to the limits of a particular language to resolve A and not A. Type 2 contradictions, on the other hand, are those that are due to the limits of a particular perspective to resolve A and not A. Type 2 contradictions, on the other hand, are those that are due to the limits of a particular paradigm to resolve A and not A. Type 2 contradictions, on the other hand, are those that are due to the limits of a particular model of reality to resolve A and not A. Type 2 contradictions, on the other hand, are those that are due to the limits of a particular worldview to resolve A and not A. These contradictions are objective in that they are unavoidable consequences of the limits of precision in language. Stated another way, the claim that is being made is that type 2 contradictions are an ever-present, eternal, objective truth of language that cannot be dealt with from within. From the perspective of those who are trapped in the language that is producing the contradiction, A and not A cannot be rationally true. But to an observer in a higher dimensional, higher resolution language whose lower resolution structure is consistent with that of the former language, there exists a logically sound structure in which A and not A is no longer a contradiction. Let me say that again. But to an observer in a higher dimensional, higher resolution language whose lower resolution structure is consistent with that of the former language, there exists a logically sound structure in which A and not A is no longer a contradiction, meaning you go to a higher dimensional state of being, a higher resolution, a space of higher precision, so that when looking down at the language that produces the contradiction, when you look down on it, it's no longer a not. It's no longer a contradiction. It's resolved because you're in a higher dimensional space. That point where A and not A, those are what koans are in Buddhism. They're koans. They're gauge gates. And they're designed to produce a contradiction that when you think of them and you actually are able to resolve them, leads you to a higher state of awareness. That's what koans do. So I've actually gone off the beaten path of the poem. This is just something I'm adding in there because I thought that one line would have been particularly confusing. So I just had to stop and explain it. Okay, continuing. But for one to enter into this higher dimensional language, this higher dimensional perception of reality, they must begin with faith that A and not A is true. They must listen to their intuition, that voice who calls them from beyond reason to enter into the void to create order. They must abandon reason to seek truth from beyond the borders of perception. For those in search of truth, it is the only reasonable thing to do. That is, to be rational is to not be rational. A and not A. As an example of a type 2 contradiction, let us consider imaginary numbers. What are imaginary numbers? Well, they are the consequence of a contradiction. In particular, they are the consequence of the contradiction of the double negative that stems from the definition of a square root. Let x be any positive real number. Then the square root of x is defined as the number y such that y squared is equal to x. That is, y times y is equal to the square root of x times the square root of x, which is equal to x. But notice what happens when we use negative y as the square root of x instead of y. What we get is negative negative times the square root of x times the square root of x. The two negative signs cancel, leaving only the square root of x times the square root of x, which equals x. As can be seen, both y and negative y give the same positive number, which is precisely the nature of the double negative. If one begins with the proposition A, then moves to the proposition not A, then moving to the proposition not A returns us back to A. Treating A and not A as a binary, there are no other possibilities other than returning back to A from a double negative. So what does this have to do with imaginary numbers? Well, an imaginary number is a number that takes the form square root of negative x. This means for a number w to be the square root of negative x, then w squared must equal to the square root of negative x times the square root of negative x, which equals negative x. That means we have to imagine a number that when multiplied by itself gives a negative number. Since the square root of a number is defined by multiplying a number by itself, the resulting output must be positive. Anything else is an unfathomable, irrational contradiction of the double negative. It simply makes no sense. In response to this conundrum, mathematicians threw up their hands and said, let's imagine a space that is beyond the comprehension of real numbers exists. And since these numbers literally cannot be real, we will call them imaginary. Thus, an extra dimension of space was added to the real space and the complex plane was born. The moral of the above story is to resolve the paradox of the double negative when defining numbers of the form square root of negative x, mathematicians had to imagine a higher dimensional space to resolve the paradox. The perception of real numbers did not have the needed degrees of freedom to resolve the contradiction. Therefore, one just assumes the contradiction is true and creates a higher dimensional language called complex numbers to solve the problem. This is the claim of this essay. There are unavoidable contradictions in language, no matter how logically sound they are. But true contradictions of type 2 that exist are passages to higher dimensional languages, and to traverse them, one must embrace the paradox. They must embrace the ultimate abstraction and abandon reason. But one must also be pure of mind and heart to see when a contradiction is of type 1 or type 2. If a type 1 contradiction is mistaken for a type 2, then embracing it may result in one's downfall or worse. On the other hand, if a type 2 contradiction is mistaken for type 1, then an opportunity for higher truths may be lost. Being able to tell the difference requires sight and a relationship with truth. Because how else is one convinced to embrace the irrational if they don't have a strong sense that the truth is pulling them along from the other side?